A note before we begin. There is a particular kind of evening that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with fanfare or spectacle. It simply settles, the way a wool blanket settles when someone with careful hands smooths it over your shoulders. You don't realize how much you needed it until it's already there, already warm, already holding you. Tonight is one of those evenings. Somewhere outside your window, the world is doing what it always does, turning, breathing, shifting through its endless quiet rhythms. But in here, right now, none of that requires your attention. You've carried enough today. You've thought enough, moved enough, solved enough. Every muscle that worked today has earned its rest. Every thought that ran its course has earned its stillness. So let your shoulders come down just a little, not forced, just allowed. Let your jaw unclench if it was clenched. Let the space between your eyebrows soften. Let your hands lie open or curled gently, whichever feels more like coming home. Notice the weight of your body, real, solid, present, sinking, just slightly more into where you lie. You don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to become anything different. You are already exactly where you need to be. There is nothing to solve tonight. There is only this, a story about a porch, and rain, and the very first breath of autumn moving through the air like something ancient and kind, come to remind us that change can be beautiful, that endings can be tender, that sometimes the most extraordinary thing in the world is a woman sitting quietly on a wooden porch, watching the season turn, with a warm mug between her hands and nowhere else she needs to be. Let the day lift from you the way morning mist lifts from a field. There, just like that. And now, let's begin. Chapter 1, Eleanor. The summer had been stubborn. Even into September, it had clung to the hills of Harrow's crossing with the particular tenacity of something that knows it's losing, but refuses to admit defeat, sending hot afternoons rolling through the valley, baking the creek beds to pale clay, keeping the maple trees in their heavy green coats long past when they ought to have started changing. The farmers had grumbled about it. The children had loved it. The old women who gathered on Thursday mornings at Mabel Prentice's kitchen table had sipped their coffee and agreed that something was different this year, though none of them could say exactly what. Eleanor Marsh had simply waited. She was good at waiting. She had become good at it, the way a person becomes good at anything, not by choosing to, but by being given no other option and eventually finding, somewhere in the middle of that long practice, that it wasn't such a bad thing after all. Waiting, she had discovered, was really just another word for paying attention. And paying attention, as it turned out, was one of the great quiet pleasures of being alive. She was 53 years old, Eleanor Marsh. She had brown hair that had been going silver at the temples for the past 5 years, and which she had stopped fighting approximately 4 years and 11 months ago. She had laugh lines around her eyes and a small scar on her left hand from a gardening accident that had happened when she was 31, and which she now considered one of the more honest things about her appearance. She was neither tall nor short. She wore reading glasses that she was always misplacing. She drank her coffee black in the morning and with a splash of cream in the afternoon, and she considered this one of the finer distinctions in her daily life. She lived in a house on Millbrook Lane that she had shared with her husband Daniel for 22 years, and which she had lived in alone for the past 3. That was not. She had been careful to remind herself on the harder days the whole story. It was just a fact. A plain, true, complicated fact, like most of the important ones. The house was white with green shutters. It sat on half an acre of land that included a vegetable garden, a small stone path, 3 apple trees that produced fruit every other year with maddening inconsistency, and a covered porch that ran the full length of the front face of the house. The porch had a swing on one end, old, wooden, painted the same green as the shutters, and 2 deep wicker chairs on the other, separated by a small table that had, at various times over the years, held books, cold glasses, warm mugs, potted herbs, a bird feeder that had never actually attracted birds, and one memorable summer, a tortoise named Gerald who had wandered up from the road and stayed for 11 days before wandering away again. The porch, Eleanor had come to believe, was the truest part of the house, not because it was the prettiest, though it was pleasant enough, but because it was the place where the inside and the outside met, where you could be sheltered and still feel the world, where you could be still and still be part of the turning, breathing, living landscape around you. She had read more books on that porch than in any room in the house. She had drunk more cups of tea. She had watched more sunsets, heard more birdsong, felt more seasons arrive and depart than anywhere else she could name. And now, on the 14th of September, she sat in the left-hand wicker chair with a mug of chamomile between her palms and watched the sky do something it hadn't done in weeks. It was darkening in the west with intent. Not the flat charcoal of an ordinary evening coming on, not the warm, deep blue of clear dusk. This was a different color entirely, the kind of dark that carries weight, that has texture, that rolls in from the horizon with the slow, certain dignity of something that has been traveling a long way and has finally arrived. Eleanor leaned back in her chair and breathed it in. The air had changed already. Even before a single drop had fallen, the air had changed. She could smell it, that particular, impossible-to-name scent that arrives before rain, green and mineral and ancient, like stone that has been sleeping and is beginning to dream. It was petrichor, she knew the word, but the word had always struck her as too clean and scientific for something so deeply felt, something that could reach into the middle of you and pull at something you didn't even know was there. It smelled like childhood. It smelled like every autumn she had ever known, compressed into a single long breath. She pulled her cardigan closer across her chest, not from cold, not quite, but from that instinct that comes with the approach of weather, the body's old animal knowledge that something is shifting, and it is good to draw in just slightly. The cardigan was dark green wool, slightly too large, and it had been Daniel's before it was hers. She wore it without thinking about it too much, the way you carry certain things, not as ceremony or symbol, but simply because it's warm and because it's there, and because the weight of it is familiar in a way that requires no explanation. The first leaf fell from the maple at the edge of the yard. Just one, a single, broad leaf the color of a very old coin, not yet the deep red or flame orange that would come later, but already not green, already on its way, already beginning the slow, bright journey that was autumn's particular genius. It turned once in the thickening air and came to rest on the stone path below. Eleanor watched it land, and then, as if that single leaf had been the signal the sky was waiting for, the rain began. Chapter 2, The First Drops. It came so softly that at first it was barely distinguishable from the changed quality of the air itself. Just a few drops. Tentative, almost questioning, as if the sky were testing the ground, checking whether it was wanted. A drop on the roof of the porch, barely audible. A drop on the stone path, leaving a small dark mark like a period at the end of a sentence. A drop on the broad leaf of the hydrangea that grew in the pot by the porch steps, producing a sound so brief and musical that Eleanor turned her head toward it as if someone had plucked a single string. She set down her mug on the little side table. She sat up very slightly in her chair, and she watched. There is something about the first rain after a long, dry stretch that is unlike any other. It isn't just water falling from the sky. The mechanics are unchanged, the physics identical, but the meaning of it is entirely different. The ground receives it differently. The air receives it differently. And the person watching receives it differently too, with something older than thought, something down in the chest that recognizes this as an event, and not merely a weather pattern. The drops came more steadily now. You could hear the rhythm of them assembling. First, just the random percussion of individual drops on leaves and pavement and rooftop. And then, gradually, the individual sounds merging into something larger, something continuous, a kind of soft white noise that had texture and depth, and 1,000 tiny variations within it. Eleanor had lived in this house long enough to know its rain vocabulary by heart. There was the sound on the porch roof, a reliable, steady drumming, never too loud, never too soft, like someone keeping a gentle beat with the flat of their hand on a hollow box. There was the sound in the maple tree at the edge of the yard, fuller, more complex, the drops hitting differently sized leaves at different angles, producing a layered rustling that was more like music than percussion. There was the sound in the garden, a softer sound, the rain being absorbed into earth that hadn't received it in too long, almost grateful, almost sighing. And there was the sound on the stone path, each drop a distinct, hard click, leaving its brief dark mark before the stone grew uniformly wet, and the individual marks disappeared into the general shining. She could hear all of them at once, and the effect was like a kind of orchestration, different instruments playing together, each with its own timbre and character, all contributing to something larger than the sum of its parts. She reached for her mug again. The chamomile was still warm. She held it in both hands without drinking, letting the warmth travel through her palms, up through her wrists, spreading in the unhurried way of good warmth, not flash heat, not urgent, just a steady and reliable comfort that asked nothing in return. Across the yard, the apple trees moved. Their leaves caught the rain with small, bright shivers, and the half-ripe apples that still clung to the branches swayed with a barely perceptible heaviness. They had been waiting too, she thought, the apples, though that was perhaps projecting. Still, she had always believed that a garden had its moods, that a yard that was lived in and tended and paid attention to develop something like a relationship with the person who cared for it, and that this relationship was not entirely one-directional. She had told Daniel that once, years ago, when they were weeding the vegetable garden on a Saturday afternoon, and he had laughed, not unkindly, never unkindly, but with the gentle amusement of a man who preferred measurable things. He had squeezed her hand over the bean plants and said, "You're talking to the tomatoes again, aren't you?" And she had said, "I'm talking about the tomatoes. There's a difference." She smiled now, remembering it. The memory arrived quietly, the way the good ones tended to these days, not with the old sharpness, not with the catching sensation in the throat that used to accompany even the smallest recollection, but with something softer and more sustainable, something that was still loss, still unmistakably loss, but loss that had been worn smooth at the edges, the way a river stone gets worn smooth over years and decades, until it is a pleasant thing to hold in your palm. The rain intensified, not dramatically, not a downpour, not a storm, just a deepening. The drops were closer together now, the gaps between them filling, the rhythm becoming more insistent without ever becoming aggressive. The porch held her sheltered from it, the old tin roof doing its job with quiet faithfulness, and the rain fell just beyond the edge of the overhang in an almost transparent curtain, not quite a wall, not quite a veil, something in between, something that defined the edge between her sheltered world and the wet one beyond. She watched that curtain of rain. She could see through it, faintly, could see the yard darkening, the stone path growing wet and reflective, the apple trees moving in their gentle rain dance, the maple at the edge shedding another leaf and another, the falling leaves describing slow arcs through the rain that altered their trajectory, pulling them sideways, tumbling them, so that each one fell differently from the last, and no two journeys were quite the same. This, she thought, was what autumn actually was. Not pumpkins and sweaters, and the aesthetic vocabulary the world attached to the season, though those things had their place. But this particular quality of air and light and moisture, this particular mood the world fell into when it was preparing to let things go. This willingness of leaves to release the branch, this gratitude of earth for water, this darkening of the sky that wasn't threat but invitation. Come inside, it said, or stay out and be moved. Either way, something is shifting. Either way, the world is turning its page. Eleanor lifted her mug and drank. The chamomile was exactly right, warm without being hot, lightly sweet, carrying the dried flower perfume that she had always associated with evenings rather than mornings, with settling rather than beginning. She had read once that chamomile had been drunk as a calming preparation for centuries, across dozens of cultures, that it was one of those things humanity had discovered and rediscovered and passed forward through generations, not through any formal instruction, but through the simple shared wisdom of, this helps. Drink this. It helps. She found that thought deeply comforting. The idea that some things had always been true, that some comforts were not invented, but discovered, found, waiting in the natural world, like stones already smoothed into handles, already fitted for human hands. Chapter 3. Millbrook Lane at Dusk. The lane that ran past Eleanor's house was one of those roads that had never quite caught up with modernity, and which was all the better for it. It had been paved at some point decades ago, but the paving had been worn and cracked and patched so many times over the years that it now had the character of something organic rather than manufactured pale gray in places, darker in others, with a line of old maples running down one side that had been there long before the pavement, and which had gradually, imperceptibly, been winning their argument with it, roots pushing up through the tarmac in gentle insistences, cracks running from the trees like the lines of a map. In summer, the lane was a tunnel of green, the maple branches meeting overhead, dappling everything below in shifting, liquid light. In winter it was spare and dignified, the bare branches against the white sky making something almost architectural. But in autumn, it was transformed in a way that seemed, every single year, more remarkable than Eleanor expected. Every year she thought she had remembered it accurately. Every year she was wrong, because the colors the maples turned were not merely red and orange and yellow. They were 100 variations of those things, and those variations lived in constant relation to each other, and to the light that moved through them, and particular quality of the season's air. There were leaves that were the color of flame, yes, but not the orange of traffic cones or package labels. A living orange, an orange that had depth and warmth, and suggested fire without being fire. There were leaves that were red the way old brick was red, or the way certain roses were red, with a kind of dignity about them. And there were leaves that were yellow in the way of late afternoon sun, almost luminous, almost lit from within. And now, in the rain, all of those colors were deepened and brightened simultaneously. The way wet paint is richer than dry. The way wet stone reveals the colors hidden inside it. The lane was glistening. Every leaf held its drop, or 5 or 20. Each drop a small lens that caught and concentrated the last of the evening light into tiny bright points. Eleanor could see a stretch of it from her porch, the curve where the lane turned past the Hendersons' fence, the row of maples, the old stone wall that marked the boundary of the Calloway property, and which had been there, by local estimate, since around 1890. The wall was dark with moisture now, the moss that grew in its crevices already brightening from the rain's attention. 2 houses down, a light came on in a window. It was soft and warm lamplight rather than overhead light, and in the rain and the thickening dusk, it appeared like something from a painting. That particular intimate warmth of a lit window in a gray evening, promising shelter and humanity, and the small ordinary dramas of a household settling into its evening. Eleanor knew whose window it was. Margaret Calloway, who was 78 and had lived in that house for 51 years, and who made the best soda bread in the county, and who kept a garden that was, by Eleanor's unbiased estimation, roughly 3 times as beautiful as anything in any of the glossy gardening magazines that came through the mail. Margaret's curtains were cream-colored with a faint blue stripe, and the lamp that shone through them had a silk shade the color of old amber. And even from 2 houses away, even through rain, the combined effect was one of unmistakable warmth. There was something deeply reassuring about a neighbor's window lit against the evening. Eleanor had never articulated this to anyone, but she felt it reliably whenever she sat on the porch in the fading light and watched the houses along the lane begin to glow one by one. It was the visual equivalent of hearing someone else breathing in the dark. "You are not alone," it said. "You are part of something. There are other lives happening nearby, and they are warm and lit and continuing." She had needed that knowledge more in the first months after Daniel than she had needed almost anything else. Not company, exactly. Not conversation or intervention, or the well-meaning kindnesses that had been offered, and which she had received with genuine gratitude, but which had not, in the end, been what her particular grief required. Just this, proximity, the knowledge of other lives nearby, going on in their ordinary way, not requiring anything of her but also not leaving her entirely alone in the dark. The rain continued. It had found its rhythm now, the particular rhythm of a rain that intends to stay for a while. That is not a passing shower or a brief weather event, but a proper autumn rain, settling in for the evening, committed to its purpose. There was something almost restful in that permanence. A brief rain required you to consider its brevity, to wonder when it would stop, to manage your plans around its likely duration. But a rain that clearly meant to stay through the evening released you from all of that. There was nothing to wait for, nothing to time yourself against. The rain was here and would be here, and there was only the now of it, which was soft and gray and smelled of everything good. Eleanor thought about going inside to get the book she had left on the kitchen table. She thought about it and didn't move. The book could wait. The porch could not, or rather, the porch would not remain exactly this way for long. This precise quality of evening, this first rain quality, this particular marriage of dusk and rain and September air, and the faint smell of turning leaves, and the sound of Margaret Calloway's lane growing quiet with weather. This would not exist twice. It existed now for her on this porch, in this chair, with this mug. And if she went inside to get her book, it would exist without her for those 2 or 3 minutes. And then it would have moved on, and what returned to the porch would be something slightly different. She was good at knowing this. She had learned it late, which was how most people learned the important things, and she had learned it through loss, which was how most people learned the important things too. But she had learned it. That moments, genuine moments, did not pause. That the appropriate response to a beautiful present was to be present in it, fully and without reservation. To let it have your full attention the way a good guest deserves your full attention, and not just the portion of it that isn't already occupied by the next thing or the thing after that. So she stayed, and the rain came down, and the lane glistened, and Margaret Calloway's window glowed, and the maple at the edge of the yard lost its leaves one at a time, each one letting go at its own pace, each one falling in its own particular way, none of them the same. Chapter 4. The Garden's Memory. There was a garden on the east side of the house that Eleanor had built almost entirely alone over the course of 7 years. Not built. That was the wrong word for a garden. Coaxed, perhaps. Collaborated with. Had a long, occasionally difficult, ultimately rewarding conversation with. It had started as a strip of earth between the house and the old wooden fence that ran along the property line, compacted, shaded in the morning, not particularly promising. The previous owners had grown nothing there except a determined crop of dandelions and a single ancient rose bush that had survived in spite of everything, not because of anything, through sheer botanical stubbornness. Eleanor had begun with that rose bush. She had cut it back hard in the first spring, which had felt almost violent, a kind of trust exercise. You had to believe that what looked like destruction was actually invitation, that the plant would understand and respond and come back stronger and more itself than it had been when it was sprawling and half dead and cluttered with dead canes. And it had. By June it was unrecognizable, a dense, arching mass of dark green leaves, and a succession of blooms in a color that Eleanor had not expected, and which had stopped her in her tracks the first morning she'd found them open. A deep, layered pink that in certain lights was almost red, and in others was almost coral, with white at the center of each bloom where the petals unfurled, as if the flower were showing you its most private self. She had named it Henry. This was not, she knew, standard horticultural practice. From there, the garden had grown in the way that gardens grown by genuinely interested people tend to grow, not according to a master plan, but through a process of discovery and experiment, and the particular kind of serendipity that happens when you pay close attention to what things want to be. She had planted foxgloves against the fence because she loved their height and their spotted throats, and they had seeded themselves into the cracks of the fence post, and now appeared every summer in slightly different arrangements, showing up in unexpected places as if they were making their own decisions about where to grow. She had planted lavender along the edge nearest the path because she loved the smell of it when she brushed it with her hand, and the lavender had obliged by spreading slowly and generously, and now formed a low, fragrant hedge that hummed with bees through June and July and part of August, and which she would walk past slowly, deliberately, every morning during those months, trailing her fingers through it. There were peonies, 3 of them, planted in a triangular cluster that had taken 3 years to start flowering, and which now each spring produced blooms of such extravagant, ruffled beauty that Eleanor felt almost embarrassed on their behalf. There was a small stand of ornamental grasses that moved in the lightest breeze with a dry, papery sound that she found inexplicably comforting. There was a climbing hydrangea on the fence that had taken 4 years to establish, and which now covered 6 feet of fence in its slow, lace-capped way, turning cream in June, and drying to parchment through autumn, where it stayed all winter, still beautiful in its dried state, still providing structure and interest when everything else had died back. And there was, at the far end nearest the property line, a Japanese maple that she had planted 8 years ago as a small, tentative thing in a nursery pot, and which had grown into, well, into itself, which was the best thing any living thing could do. It was small as trees went, but perfectly formed, with a canopy of delicate, deeply lobed leaves that in summer were a dark, smoky green tinged with burgundy, and which in autumn in late September and October, when the season had finally fully committed, turned a color that Eleanor had no adequate word for, something between red and orange and bronze, all three at once, a color that seemed to contain light rather than merely reflect it. It was not yet in full color. Not tonight. The season had barely turned, but she could see from her porch, through the curtain of rain, that the maple had changed, that the edges of its leaves were beginning their slow ignition, that the first hints of copper and amber were appearing in the outermost canopy, just barely, just enough to suggest what was coming, as if the tree had lit a single candle in a dark room, just to give you the idea, just to show you the direction things were heading. She had always loved the before of things, the before of rain, when the air changed and the sky darkened, the before of sunrise, when the horizon began its slow brightening, the before of a good book, when you were holding it in your hands and hadn't yet opened it, the before of autumn, when summer was releasing its hold and the world was tilting, almost imperceptibly, towards something cooler and more contemplative. The garden was wet now. She could hear it, the particular sound of a garden being rained on, which was different from the sound of rain on hard surfaces, softer and more complex. The drops landing on leaves of different sizes and textures and sounds, some making small sounds and some making large sounds, the flowers receiving it differently from the grasses, the soil differently from the stones. The smell of it was extraordinary. The smell of a rained-on garden was something she had never been able to adequately describe, though she had tried many times in the journal she kept, sometimes successfully and sometimes not. It was green and mineral and organic in the deepest sense of that word, the smell of living things, of growing things, of the perpetual, patient chemistry of soil and roots and rain. She breathed it in slowly, let it move through her. There was a robin on the fence post. She hadn't seen it land. It had simply appeared, as birds often seemed to, between one moment and the next. It was sitting on the top of the old wooden post at the corner of the garden, its rust-red chest bright in the gray light, its small bright eye regarding the garden with what looked very much like satisfaction. It wasn't sheltering from the rain. It appeared to be in the rain by choice, sitting in it with the quiet contentment of something that has no reason to prefer otherwise. Eleanor watched it. It watched the garden. After a while it flew, not away, but simply to a different spot, landing on the arm of the stone bird bath in the center of the garden, where the rain was already forming a small dancing surface of drops on drops. The robin dipped its beak, stood very still. Then, with one unhurried movement, stepped to the edge of the bowl and lifted off and was gone into the gray and green of the rain. She smiled. Chapter 5. The Smell of Rain and Wool. Eleanor set her now empty mug on the table and pulled her knees up slightly in the wicker chair, wrapping her cardigan more closely around herself. The rain was steady, and the air had cooled by several degrees in the past hour. Not cold, not yet, but cooling in that directional way of early autumn, moving towards something, the temperature dropping in the way that a river descends. You know where it's going. You can feel the direction of it, and there is a comfort in that intentionality, even as it demands its adjustments. She was comfortable. This was something she noticed because she had trained herself some years ago to notice when she was comfortable, specifically and deliberately, in the way that most people only notice discomfort. It had taken practice. The default human setting seemed to be pay attention to what's wrong, to what needs fixing, to what's missing or lacking or could be better. Pay very little attention to what is exactly right, to what needs nothing from you, to what is simply, plainly, quietly good. This was exactly right. This moment, this porch, this rain, this particular smell of wool cardigan, slightly warmed by her body heat, mixed with the cool, rain-washed air coming off the garden and the lane and the darkening hills beyond. This sound of rain on the tin roof, perfectly calibrated to some frequency that seemed designed to speak directly to the part of the nervous system that handled whether or not the world was safe enough to rest. The world was safe enough to rest. She noticed that too. She let herself feel it, the loosening of some habitual vigilance, that low-level background alertness that she had come to understand was just part of being a person navigating a complicated life that required no particular stimulus to maintain itself, that was simply always there to some degree, the body's old evolutionary insistence on watching. She let it not drop, exactly. You couldn't simply set it down by deciding to, but soften. Relax its grip slightly. Ease. It happened most readily on this porch. She had a theory about this, which she had shared with no one, because it sounded precisely like the kind of thing that didn't survive the journey from feeling to words. But the theory was something like this. There were certain places and certain conditions under which the body's ancient threat assessment machinery could be most easily persuaded that everything was, for now, all right. That these conditions were not random, but had specific characteristics. That among those characteristics were shelter with visible sky, because shelter without sky felt enclosed, and without sky you couldn't monitor weather, which weather-dependent creatures apparently still needed to see. The sound of water at a safe distance, because water at a safe distance meant abundance and not flood. The smell of vegetation and rain, because these were the smells of the living world, and living world meant not being in a burned or dead one. The presence of warmth, not the warmth of danger, not the radiant heat of fire too close, but the contained, personal warmth of adequate clothing and a warm drink. The covered porch in autumn rain had all of these things. So the body relaxed, and Eleanor relaxed with it, feeling the ease of it move through her shoulders, through the back of her neck, where she always held the residue of thinking too hard, through her hands where they lay now open in her lap, palms up, receiving nothing, requiring nothing, simply open. She closed her eyes for a moment. Just the sound of the rain, just the smell of the evening, just the temperature of the air on her face, and the warmth of the wool on her arms, and the familiar solidity of the old wicker chair beneath her. Chapter 5.5. The library at the end of the lane. She thought, with her eyes closed, about the library. It was 3 miles from Millbrook Lane, in the village center, in a building that had been built in 1935 as a civic hall and converted to library use in the 1960s, and which still bore the dignified bones of its original purpose: high ceilings, tall windows that let in enormous amounts of light on good days, and on bad days created magnificent weather-watching surfaces. A main room that was too large for a small public library, but which somehow never felt empty because of the way the light fell through those windows and made pools and columns of warm light among the stacks. She had arrived there fresh from library school 28 years ago, with the particular combination of genuine enthusiasm and inexperience that characterized all good beginnings. She had been hired by the then director, a woman named Frances Alcott, who had been running the library for 11 years, and who had the methodical, organized quality of a very good librarian, combined with the warm, somewhat idiosyncratic personal presence of someone who had spent many years surrounded by books and had been inevitably influenced by that proximity. Frances had shown her around on the first day with the proprietorial pride of someone showing you their house, pointing out the things she was proud of: the children's corner, which she had designed herself, with low shelving and cushioned window seats, and a revolving display of new acquisitions: the local history section, which was more comprehensive than most collections of its size, because Frances had spent 30 years building it with methodical determination. The reading room at the back, with its 6 good chairs and its policy of absolute quiet, and the things she was resigned to the heating system, which worked perfectly in summer and was unpredictable in winter, the cataloging software, which had been purchased in 1998 and which they were still using because the funding for its replacement had been approved, deferred, approved, and deferred again in a cycle that had become almost ritual. Eleanor had loved it immediately. She had loved the smell of it, the specific, unmistakable smell of a working library, which was not quite the smell of books, which was its own complex thing: paper and ink and glue, and the faint organic note of aging, the smell of thousands of separate objects with their own histories accumulated into a single ambient note, but was also the smell of people, of the passing through, the dust of decades of use, the faint perfume of cleaning products and radiator warmth, and the coffee that Frances drank at her desk from a thermos, and which she offered to everyone, regardless of whether they were colleagues or patrons, with the same democratic hospitality. She had loved the work itself, the specific, peculiar, completely underrated work of understanding a library's community, learning who needed what, building the pattern knowledge that allowed you to say, with reasonable confidence, that Mrs. Chen, who came in every Thursday afternoon, would like the new novel by the author she had mentioned 3 months ago, that the retired teacher who came in on Tuesday mornings and browsed the history section without purpose was really looking for something about the Second World War, specifically about the Italian campaign, which had been where his father had served, that the young woman who had been coming in for 6 months with a slightly anxious, private quality to her visits was working up to asking for books on a particular topic that she hadn't yet named, and that the right thing to do was to leave good relevant books in places she could find them without having to ask. This last instinct, the instinct for the unasked question, for what people needed before they knew how to say they needed it, was what she had come to think of as the heart of the work. It required attention. Real attention, not the performed variety. It required building, over time, a picture of a community of readers that was both general. These are the kinds of books that are read in this town. These are the subjects this community values. These are the gaps, and specific. This is who comes in on Thursdays. This is what she is like. This is what she reads. This is what might surprise her in a good way. She had been doing it for 28 years. She was, if she was honest, very good at it. And it was this quality of sustained, patient, particular attention to other people's inner lives, that she believed the library had given her in return for the years she had given it. Not just as a skill, but as a disposition, a way of being with people that carried over into the rest of her life, into her friendships and her marriage and her relationship with her garden, and yes, with her porch. The attention that had made her a good librarian was the same attention she brought to this porch on a rainy September evening. The attention that let her hear the creek in the dark, that let her catalog the sounds of rain on different surfaces, that let her notice exactly when Margaret Calloway's expression changed from neighborly concern to something that was actually warm, genuinely warm, the kind of warmth that only comes from long acquaintance and genuine fondness, and to feel the full value of that warmth rather than letting it pass unregistered. She had always been an attentive person. She had always tended toward the interior, but the library had deepened it, had given it purpose and practice and direction, had made it, she believed, more generous as well as more acute. Because the attention you gave to what other people needed was not the same as the attention you gave only to yourself. It was larger. It required you to step outside your own preoccupations and be genuinely curious about another person's inner landscape, their desires and confusions, and the things they didn't yet know how to say. She had become, through the library, a person more interested in other people. She had become a better neighbor, a better wife, a better friend. She was aware this was not a story about the library. She was aware that she had arrived on this porch to watch the rain and had, in the comfortable, drifting way of an evening well spent, arrived at the library. The mind did this when you gave it room. It went where it went. She let it. She had always been good at letting the mind go where it went. The rain continued. She opened her eyes and looked out at the lane. She had grown up in a house with a large garden and had spent a disproportionate amount of her childhood in it. And she had always assumed this was just something she did, a habit, a preference. It had taken until she was well into adulthood to understand that it was actually something she needed. The need had become most apparent in her late 30s, when she and Daniel had lived for 2 years in a city apartment, while he was completing a research fellowship. The apartment had been lovely, genuinely lovely, high-ceilinged and light-filled, on the 4th floor with a view of the street, and a small terrace with 2 potted plants that Eleanor had tended with an attentiveness that probably looked, to any objective observer, slightly obsessive. And they had been happy there, genuinely happy, with the city happening outside their windows and the restaurants 2 streets over, and the park that was a 15-minute walk and good for most of her outdoor needs. But she had felt, for those 2 years, like a plant in a slightly too small pot, not suffering, not dying, just slightly constrained, slightly more of herself than the space could quite accommodate. Coming back to Millbrook Lane had been, she had no better word for it, a restoration, like a painting returned to the light after years in storage, like a piece of music played at the right tempo after years of being played too fast. She had arrived home, and the house had recognized her, and she had recognized the house, and the garden had needed weeding, but had been glad to see her. She had known it was glad, in whatever non-anthropomorphic sense that could be said to be true. She opened her eyes. The rain was still falling. The lane was deeply dark now, the sky fully committed to its October preview evening. The streetlight at the corner had come on, that thin, orange-tinged sodium light that she found slightly sad in the way. She found all sodium lights slightly sad, as if they were doing their best, but knew it wasn't quite enough. But tonight, it served its purpose, throwing a circle of wet orange light onto the lane and making the rain visible as it fell through it, each drop briefly illuminated before it hit the pavement and disappeared. It was beautiful in its own way. Everything was, if you looked long enough. Chapter 6, Margaret's Knock. She heard the garden gate before she heard the footsteps. The gate at the end of the front path had a particular sound, a 2-part sound. First the click of the latch, and then a soft, low creak as the gate swung open. a creek that Eleanor had been meaning to oil for the better part of a year, and which she now admitted privately, been quietly preserving. She knew her gate by its sound. She knew when the postman arrived, and when the Hendersons' tabby cat had worked out how to push through the gap, and when the wind was from the southwest, because the gate would tick back and forth against its latch in that very particular way. Tonight it was neither cat nor postman. The footsteps on the path were soft but deliberate, the unhurried walk of someone who knew where they were going and was not concerned about the weather. And Eleanor looked up from her thoughts to see, emerging from the rain at the edge of the porch light's reach, the familiar compact figure of Margaret Calloway. She was wearing a rain hat, a proper one, the kind of brimmed waterproof hat that had been purchased for purpose and used for purpose for decades, that had the dignified, weathered quality of genuinely useful things. She was carrying what appeared to be a covered dish. "I made too much soup," Margaret said, by way of explanation, coming up the porch steps with the ease of someone who had climbed them many times. She was 78 and moved like someone who had decided at some point that age was not going to change her relationship with her own body, and had largely won that argument through sheer contrariness. She was small, had always been small, with white hair that she kept short and practical, silver-framed glasses, and a face that had the kind of character that comes from having been genuinely interested in the world for a very long time. Eleanor stood to hold the door, but Margaret shook her head. "I'm not staying," she said. "I just wanted to see who was sitting on the porch in the rain. I looked out my window and saw your light on, and I thought, well, Eleanor." She said the name with a particular intonation that was both fond and slightly exasperated, which was perhaps the most accurate description of their friendship. "Take this." She held out the dish. "It's the leek and potato. I used the last of the garden's leeks." Eleanor took it. The dish was warm through the towel Margaret had wrapped around it, and through the covering she could smell it, the deep, buttery, sweet onion smell of a proper leek soup done right, the kind that required actual attention and actual time and actual care, and could not be hurried. "Your last leeks," Eleanor said. "Margaret, I grew too many. I always grow too many. Every year I think this will be the year I plant the right amount of leeks, and every year I am wrong." Margaret looked out at the rain with an expression of someone who has accepted the fundamental unknowability of the world and made peace with it. "Good rain," she said, in the tone of someone bestowing an assessment. "The first," Eleanor said. "I know." Margaret was quiet for a moment, watching. The rain fell steadily. The streetlight made the lane into something almost magical. That same mysterious alchemy of light and water and dark that turned ordinary things into something else entirely. Do you remember the first rain of autumn the year we moved in? On the lane, I mean. Your first autumn here, Eleanor thought. 1998, she said. October, wasn't it? Late October, October 9th. Margaret was decisive on this point. I remember because I'd just put the garden to bed the week before, turned the beds, laid the mulch. And then the rain came and I stood at my kitchen window and thought, well, there it is. The season. Done. She paused. I was relieved, I think. I'd been gardening all summer, and I was tired, and the rain felt like permission. To stop, to go inside, to be still for a bit. Margaret turned back from the rain. Her glasses had small raindrops on them that caught the light and made her look as if she were seeing the world through tiny lenses of water. You're all right, Eleanor. The question was not performed. Margaret did not perform concern. She asked it directly from the place where she actually lived, and she expected an answer from the same place. I am, Eleanor said, and she was. I've been waiting for this. The first rain, I wanted to see it. Margaret considered her. Good, she said, with the decisive quality that characterized most of her pronouncements. That's the right way to spend an evening. She turned for the steps. The soup needs about 5 minutes on a low heat. Don't boil it. I won't boil it. You boiled the bisque. The bisque was different. The bisque needed a low simmer. You boiled it. Margaret had reached the bottom of the porch steps. She paused, looking up, and her expression in the porch light was warm in the way that only truly old friendships could manage, containing years of disagreement and laughter and shared silences and the mutual observation of each other's lives, all compressed into a single look. Enjoy your rain, Eleanor. Good night, Margaret. She watched her neighbor make her way back down the path and through the gate, and along the lane through the rain, walking without hurrying, her hat doing its job, the covered dish operation successfully completed. At her own gate, she paused once, looked back, raised a hand. Eleanor raised hers, and Margaret Calloway went inside. Eleanor stood holding the warm dish and watching the empty lane for a moment, and she felt something that she could only call fullness, not the fullness of a meal or of completion, but the fullness of a life that contained people who brought you soup in the rain without being asked, who had seen you through things, who would climb your porch steps on an autumn evening because they saw a light on and wanted to check. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, rather a lot. She thought about the nature of that kind of friendship, the kind that Margaret Calloway embodied with such practical, unsentimental thoroughness. It was not a friendship that spoke of itself. It did not require regular checking in or maintained correspondence or any of the formal scaffolding by which many friendships survived. It was a friendship made of proximity and shared decades, and the particular understanding that came from watching another person move through the material of their life from next door, watching them garden, watching their cars change in the driveway, hearing the sounds of holidays and ordinary Tuesdays, knowing when the lights were on late and when they were off early, being woven into the fabric of another person's ordinary days to a degree that was, if you thought about it clearly, quite extraordinary. She had known Margaret for 25 years, had received soup from her in every iteration of need and non-need. When Daniel had been in hospital those 3 days the winter before his death, and Margaret had appeared daily with dishes, quietly, without comment or expectation. When Eleanor had had her appendix out in her mid-40s and had found a lasagna on the porch steps without knowing who had left it until the pan was returned, when there had been no particular reason at all, and Margaret had simply made too much of something and thought of her neighbor. And when Eleanor had first moved to the lane 25 years ago, not knowing anyone, finding the whole business of a new house and a new place slightly daunting in the way that only people who found change somewhat exhausting could find it, Margaret had come with cake. Not soup then, lemon cake with a thin white glaze, slightly too much of it, in the way that Margaret always made slightly too much of things. She had stayed for tea, and they had talked, not about important things, not at first, about the lane, about the Marchellis who had been in the house before Eleanor and Daniel, about the garden, what Eleanor was thinking of doing with it, whether the old rose bush could be saved, about the stone wall at the Callaway property line, and what might live in its crevices, which had led to a 20-minute conversation about the relative merits of various plants for wall planting that Eleanor had participated in with genuine interest. By the time Margaret left, Eleanor had felt the particular satisfaction of a neighbor well met. Not a friend yet, not in the full sense, but a person who was interested and interesting, and who would be there on the lane for the foreseeable future, and who made lemon cake. 25 years later, she brought leek soup in the rain and said, "I made too much." The relationship had barely changed in its essential character. Eleanor loved this about it. The consistency, the knowledge that some things didn't need updating or renewing or re-examining in the light of changed circumstances. Some things were simply what they were and could be counted on to remain so. And this was not stagnation, but its opposite. It was the deep-rooted quality of something that had been given time to become fully itself. She carried the soup inside to warm it, and she stood at the stove and watched it over the low flame that Margaret had specified, and did not let it boil, because she had boiled the bisque, and she was not going to repeat herself. The soup moved in its slow, warm way in the pot, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of leek and potato and butter, and the rain sounded on the back roof with a slightly different quality than on the porch roof. Not tin, but the older, heavier material that the previous owners had used on the kitchen extension. A deeper sound, more contained. She ladled the soup into her bowl and took it back to the porch. She sat down in her wicker chair, and she ate the soup in the rain, and it was exactly as good as she had known it would be. The buttery, sweet, savory depth of it, the richness of the leeks, the earthiness of the potato giving it weight and substance, the whole thing carrying the undeniable signature of food made by someone who cooked with actual attention and actual time and actual care, and could not be rushed or approximated. She ate slowly. There was nowhere to be. There was no next thing waiting. She ate slowly, the way you ate when you were not eating as fuel or as distraction, or as the accompaniment to something else, but simply as the thing itself, the satisfying, grounded, completely ordinary pleasure of warm food in a bowl, in a sheltered place, with rain on the roof. It was one of the oldest pleasures available. It hadn't changed. The rain fell on the roof, and the lane glistened, and the apple trees moved in the garden, and everything was, for this moment, fully and completely enough. Chapter 7. The Album. After the soup, she brought things out to the porch. This was not something she had planned. She had simply gone inside to wash the bowl and return it to its covered state for returning to Margaret tomorrow. And in the kitchen, she had stopped at the counter and looked at the stack of things there. The bowl she'd been meaning to put away, the calendar she'd been meaning to update, the book she'd been meaning to finish. And she had felt, quite clearly, that the porch was not done with her yet. Or she with it. She brought her second cup of tea, herbal again. Something red and warming, hibiscus and rosehip, that she made when she was in an evening mood. And she brought the small fleece blanket from the basket by the back door. And she brought, almost as an afterthought, almost because it had been sitting on the living room shelf for months in that particular way of things that were waiting for the right moment. The photograph album. It was a brown leather album, the kind that had actual pages rather than plastic sleeves, that required a particular photographic paper and actual photo corners to hold the pictures in place. She had made it herself years ago from a mix of prints and developed film photographs, before digital cameras made developing film feel like a deliberate choice rather than the only option. The spine was worn from handling, but the pages were still firm. She had made it for their 20th wedding anniversary, hers and Daniel's, as a private gift, not for display or ceremony, just for the two of them to sit together and go through. They had sat together on this very porch and gone through it, on an evening in May when the garden was just coming into bloom, and the air smelled of lilac from the bush at the corner of the property that had that year gone entirely extraordinary. She could remember it precisely. Daniel with his reading glasses on, turning the pages with that slightly careful quality he had with things that had meaning for him, saying very little, but saying it all with the quality of his attention. Her beside him with her tea, the lilac, the evening light. She settled into her chair with the blanket over her legs, and the tea on the table beside her, and the album in her lap. She didn't open it right away. For a while she simply held it, feeling its weight and its familiar texture, and watched the rain, and listened to the rain, and let the evening be what it was. There was no hurry. The album had waited months. It would wait a few more minutes. Outside, the rain had found a new note, slightly heavier now. Or perhaps the wind had shifted and was delivering it against the porch's side screen with a different angle. And the result was a richer, fuller sound, more encompassing, like being inside a sound rather than listening to one from outside. It was one of those sounds that didn't require anything of you. You could think while it played, or you could not think. You could feel things or not feel things. The rain held no preferences about how you spent your time in its company. She opened the album. The first photograph was one she had taken herself in the first year they'd had this house, before they'd learned to garden, and before Eleanor had begun the east side beds, and before the Japanese maple had been planted. The yard was bare in a way she had entirely forgotten, just grass, the apple trees younger, smaller, and the stone path. She and Daniel were standing in the middle of the yard, laughing at something that had been happening just outside the frame. She genuinely couldn't remember what. He was taller than she was by about 4 inches, and in this photo he had one arm around her shoulders and was looking sideways at her while she looked at the camera. And his expression in that sideways look was one she had seen so many times that she thought she knew every version of it and had never quite successfully described what was in it because it was too particular, too individual, too precisely his. She looked at it for a long time. The rain fell. She turned the page. There were years of photographs in the album. A decade and more of seasons and faces and occasions, small and large. A Christmas with Daniel's sister and her family. Everyone in matching terrible sweaters that Eleanor had found at a second-hand shop, and which had caused extraordinary amounts of laughter when distributed. A summer in which Eleanor had, inexplicably and somewhat alarmingly, become completely absorbed by bread making, and produced a loaf a day for about 6 weeks before the interest resolved itself as suddenly as it had arrived. A trip to Ireland, where they had rented a stone cottage for 10 days, and it had rained for 7 of them, and they had not minded at all, because the cottage had a fireplace and a shelf of old paperback novels, and the kind of magnificent, absolute nowhere else to be freedom that the best holidays produce. A photograph of the garden in its 5th year, taken from the porch on a June morning, the foxgloves at full height, the lavender just opening, Henry the rosebush in full extravagant bloom, the garden that Eleanor had built, wearing the proof of all those years of attention. There was a photograph of Margaret Calloway at a New Year's Eve party, wearing a paper crown with enormous dignity, holding a glass of champagne, looking at something off to the left with an expression of serene amusement. Eleanor smiled. There was a photograph of Eleanor and Daniel on their 21st anniversary, taken by the self-timer on the old camera set up on the garden wall, both of them slightly blurry around the edges, because one of them had moved, sitting on the porch swing with their hands laced together between them, looking at the camera with the easy comfort of people who no longer need to arrange their faces for photographs because they've stopped caring what they look like in them and have started caring only about what they feel. She held that page for a long time. The rain was soft and continuous. The evening was fully dark now, the lane deep blue-black beyond the reach of the porch light, the streetlight at the corner doing its modest sodium best. Through the garden, through the screen of rain, the lights of the nearest houses showed as soft, indistinct blurs, not cold, not lonely, but dreamlike in the way that distance and moisture combined to make them. She wasn't sad. This was important to notice. She had been afraid once that looking at photographs would be a thing she couldn't do, that the photographs were essentially a minefield, each one a detonation waiting to happen. And in the first months, they had been something like that. She had left the album on its shelf and walked past it and thought about it and chosen other things to do. But grief, she had come to understand, was not permanent in the way she had feared. It was not a static thing. It moved. It changed shape. It became, with time and with the living of other days and other evenings, not something you were stuck inside, but something you carried. Something you could bring out on a covered porch in the first rain of autumn, and hold in your lap and look at, and find inside it not only loss, but also love, not only ending, but also everything that had been whole and real and present. The photographs were evidence of all of it. She closed the album gently when she had reached the last page, set it on the table beside her tea, and looked out at the rain. Chapter 8. The sound of rain on different things. She had a habit, which she had never quite outgrown from childhood, of cataloging things. Not in a list-making way, she was not a list-maker, had always resisted the tyranny of lists, but in a quieter, more private way, a kind of internal noticing that liked to trace the edges of things, to understand them through their particular qualities. She catalogued the rain now. On the porch roof, a steady, light drumming, not loud, never startling, more the sound of something that had been there long before you arrived, and would be there after you left, doing its thing with the comfortable indifference of the reliably permanent. Under this sound, there was a secondary sound she always forgot about until she heard it again. A thin, high note, almost musical, produced by some vibration of the metal against one of the joists, too subtle to identify its exact source, but present whenever the rain reached a certain weight and rhythm. She'd heard it every autumn for decades. She would not have been able to describe it to anyone who hadn't heard it themselves. On the garden, the most complex sound of all. She had spent time with this sound over many years and was still finding new layers in it. The large leaves, the hosta at the north end of the east bed, the hydrangea, the broad-leaved things, received drops with a definitive sound, a sharp, brief note that was almost like a small drum. The smaller leaves, the lavender, the ornamental grasses, the late asters received drops with a soft, barely audible whispering. The roses, this time of year, had lost most of their leaves to the summer's end and received rain on their bare thorned canes with barely any sound at all, just an occasional tick. The soil received rain in the most satisfying way of all, a soft, absorbing sound, almost like nothing, like the sound of something drinking, the rain just going in. On the stone path, each drop a clear, individual note, a kind of random percussion that was too varied to be music, but too structured to be noise, occupying some middle territory that was entirely its own. As the path grew wetter, the sound changed, each new drop now falling on water rather than stone, and producing a slightly different, slightly flatter note. And the overall effect was that the stone path had a second instrument join the first as the rain continued. On the apple trees, she could see them from the porch, the nearer one, and she could hear the drops on the apple leaves, small, quick sounds, a rapid tattoo when the rain came through the canopy, and a softer murmur when it fell directly on the upper leaves. The apples themselves made a different sound than the leaves, heavier, more resonant, a sound like someone tapping a ripe melon, only briefer, only once per drop. She loved this sound. She had always loved this sound, and had never told anyone because there was no natural occasion on which it came up, and also because she was not entirely sure she could describe it accurately enough to convey what was lovely about it. On the lane, a continuous hissing sound, rain on asphalt, rain on the leaves of the maple trees, a sound that was large and general and enveloping, the background of everything else, the silence beneath the silence, and beyond all of it, in the middle distance, the sound of the creek. She could hear it tonight, which she couldn't always. The Millbrook, for which the lane was named, ran through the valley about a quarter-mile to the north, mostly hidden by the willows and alders that grew along its banks. And in dry weather you didn't hear it at all from this distance. But tonight, with the first rain of the season reaching it, and the creek receiving it, and the creek beginning, very gradually, to remember that it was a creek, and not a series of mud-linked puddles, tonight she could hear it, barely, just at the edge of perception, a murmur that might have been wind or imagination, but was, she was fairly certain, water. She found this unreasonably satisfying. The creek running again, the first rain of autumn doing what it was supposed to do, what it had always done, what it would do again next year, and the year after, and long after she had stopped being on the porch to hear it replenishing, filling, restoring. The world's patient self-renewal, proceeding without drama or announcement or anyone's approval. She sat with that thought for a while. There was something in it that she needed, not new information, nothing she didn't already know in some intellectual sense, but the felt knowledge of it, the experiencing of it directly rather than as a concept. The world renewed itself, without effort, without requiring anyone to be in charge of the renewal or to manage its progress. The rain fell, the creek filled, the maple changed color, the garden rested, the year turned. None of these things required her participation, and none of them were indifferent to her. She couldn't quite explain the difference between those two things, but she felt it clearly. Chapter 9. The Letters She Never Sent. Inside the house, in the second drawer of the desk, in what had been Daniel's study, and was now a room she used sometimes for reading and sometimes for nothing, there was a shoebox. She had not put it there intentionally. She had not packed it deliberately. This particular collection of things. It had accumulated the way certain things accumulate when you are in grief. Through the action of encountering them in the course of ordinary life, and not knowing what to do with them, and placing them somewhere temporarily that gradually became permanent. The shoebox contained, among other things, a small brass compass that she had given Daniel for his 40th birthday, that he had always carried in his coat pocket, and which she had found after, still in the pocket of his brown wool overcoat. 3 ticket stubs from concerts they had attended. One of them to a chamber music performance in a small hall in the city. One to a folk concert on the village green that had been interrupted by rain and then resumed. A birthday card she had written to him, and which had, for some reason she no longer remembered, never been given. A matchbook from the restaurant where they had eaten dinner on their first anniversary. A piece of paper on which he had written a grocery list in his particular handwriting, which was clear and upright and slightly old-fashioned in its letter forms. A handwriting she had loved in the way you love things you encounter daily and take for granted, and then miss with extraordinary precision, and the letters she had never sent. Not to Daniel, that was not quite what had happened. She had written them in the months after, yes, but not to him in any mystical sense. She had written them because she had had thoughts that needed an addressee, because some of the things she needed to think through required the framework of a conversation, and because she found she could think best when she wrote. They were not letters to his ghost. They were letters to the version of him that she had carried inside her, the accumulated understanding of a person built over 22 years, the interior portrait that was more complex and more true than any photograph. She had written about the garden, mostly. What she'd done with it since. Small reports. The foxgloves had decided to colonize the fence more extensively than before. The Japanese maple had survived a very dry June better than she'd expected. She had finally found the right kind of mulch for the north bed. She had written about other things too, but the garden was what she kept returning to, because the garden was the thing they had been in together, consistently, season after season. Him helping with the heavy work and largely staying out of her aesthetic decisions, which had been the arrangement that suited them both. Her making decisions about where things went and why. Him digging holes and shifting stones and making useful suggestions that she mostly ignored and occasionally adopted. She had written to him about the garden, and it had been, she thought now, a way of keeping him in it. He was in it, in a sense that was not mystical, but was also not entirely dismissible. The 22 years of his presence had shaped it. The decisions she had made while he was there had been made in a particular context, a particular kind of security, a particular quality of companionship that had informed everything. What she planted and why, what she cared about and how, the specific combination of attention and freedom that a good long-term relationship provides. The garden was not only hers. It was theirs, even now, even after. It held his handprints on the fence post he had replaced. It held the stone bench he had hauled from the back of a borrowed truck on a Saturday in April, cursing cheerfully, refusing all assistance. It held the varieties of apple he had researched with almost academic thoroughness before the trees were planted, coming home from the library, in the age of the internet, because some things were better done in person with a knowledgeable librarian. And he had known this with a stack of books about heritage apple varieties, and reading from them over dinner with the concentrated pleasure of a man engaged in something he found genuinely interesting. She thought about all of this on the porch in the rain, not with pain, not with the old pain, the sharp and destabilizing pain of the early years, but with the particular tenderness that time and love and continued living produced. The way you thought about something very important to you, something you were still in relationship with, something that was gone and not gone at once. The rain continued. The night continued. She pulled the blanket a little higher on her lap, not because she was cold, but because she wanted the weight of it. Outside, a car passed slowly on the lane, its headlights sweeping briefly across the wet pavement, illuminating the rain for a moment in those twin beams of white light before it rounded the curve and was gone, its sound diminishing, the lane returning to its previous quiet, rain-filled state. She watched the space where the headlights had been. Chapter 10. How she had come to be here. She had not always been here. She had not always been a person who sat on porches watching rain, who kept a garden, who had a neighbor who brought soup, and who cataloged the sounds of water on different surfaces, and who kept a shoebox with a brass compass in it. She had been other people first, had moved through other versions of herself, the way the season moved through its colors. Not all at once, not by sudden transformation, but through a gradual process of change, each new version growing from the previous one, carrying traces of what had been before. She had been a girl in a suburb in the south of the country, in a house that was perfectly pleasant and nothing more, in a family that was functional and warm, and not the kind of family that talked about its inner life in any depth, not because anything was suppressed, but because the vocabulary for doing so simply hadn't been acquired. She had been a reader from a very young age. This she had in common with Daniel, who had also been a reader, which had been one of the first things they had discovered about each other, and which had felt, even then, like something more significant than a mere shared preference. She had read herself into other worlds, into other lives, into the understanding that there were many more ways to be human than the particular way that her suburb modeled for her. She had found in books a kind of permission to be curious, to be interior, to find the world interesting beyond its utility. She had gone to university and studied literature, which her father had considered slightly suspect as a practical matter, and which her mother had been quietly enthusiastic about, sensing in it something she herself had never quite been able to articulate. She had spent 4 years reading things that mattered deeply to her, and having conversations about them that seemed, at the time, of colossal importance, and which in retrospect had been both less and more important than they seemed. Less because the readings had not been the final word on anything, and more because the habit of that kind of attention had never left her. She had met Daniel in the 3rd year. He was not studying literature. He was studying land ecology and geomorphology, which was, as he had explained to her on their first real conversation, sitting on a low stone wall outside the university library with their sandwiches, both of them having arrived at the only available patch of sunlight at the same time, and having negotiated wordlessly to share it, the study of how land is shaped by the forces that act upon it over time. Like geology, she had said. Like geology, but for living things too, he had said. How a hillside develops, how a river changes over centuries, how a piece of land is different now from what it was 100 years ago, and from what it will be 100 years from now. She had thought about this. I like that, she had said. That everything has a history that shows in what it looks like now. He had looked at her for a moment with an evaluative expression that she would come to recognize as him registering something worth registering. Yes, he had said. Exactly that. They had eaten their sandwiches and talked for an hour, and then she had gone to her tutorial, and he had gone to his seminar, and she had sat in the tutorial thinking about someone she had just met for the first time with a clarity that was impossible to misinterpret. The thing she had thought, specifically, was, that man knows how to pay attention. It was not a thought about attraction, though attraction was there too, present and clear from the beginning. It was about something she found harder to name and rarer to find. The quality of attention he brought to the things he cared about. She had observed it in that first conversation. The way he had described his field, not with the enthusiasm of someone trying to sell you on it, but with the pleasure of someone who thought it was genuinely interesting and expected you might find it interesting too, without pressure. The way he had listened to her response with what she could only call real listening, not the performance of listening while preparing the next thing to say, but actual receiving listening, the kind that left a small silence after you stopped speaking, a silence in which what you had just said was still being considered. She had not encountered it often. She had encountered it consistently from him for 22 years. This was the thing she was most grateful for, she thought, when she catalogued the things she was grateful for about her life with him. Not the love, though the love was real and full, and something she had not taken for granted. Not the companionship, or the shared history, or the 22 years of ordinary days that formed the infrastructure of a life together, but the attention, the specific, reliable, entirely genuine quality of his attention, which had been directed at her, at what she thought and said and felt, consistently, without diminishment, for as long as they had known each other. It was an extraordinary gift. She thought about this sometimes when she felt the loneliness most acutely, not the absence of company, which was intermittent and manageable, but the absence of that particular quality of being known, of being the person someone paid real attention to, of having your thoughts and your feelings and your somewhat idiosyncratic relationship with gardens and rain, and the sounds of water on different surfaces received with interest and even with genuine pleasure. She had told Daniel once about her thing of cataloging sounds, of the internal notebook she kept of how rain sounded on different surfaces. He had said, with complete seriousness, with no trace of gentle mockery, "Tell me some of them. The sounds. Tell me what they're like." And she had told him, lying in bed on a rainy night, going through the list, the porch roof and the garden and the apple trees and the stone path, and the difference between rain on a dry surface and rain on a wet one, the way the pitch changed, the way the volume changed, the secondary rain that came from the gathered drops on the tree branches after the primary rain had stopped. He had listened. And then he had said, "The creek sound is the one I like best. When it's been dry for a long time and you can't hear it, and then the first rain comes, and then the creek is there again. That sound." She had not known he had a thing about the creek. 22 years later, she loved that she had not known, and that she had found out. She thought about how many things she had not known and had found out. About him, about herself through him, about the world through paying attention to it together. 22 years. And then the 3 years of learning to be without him. And then this evening, this first rain of autumn, this porch, this now. She didn't think of it as a story with a clear shape. It wasn't that. It wasn't a narrative with a beginning and a middle and a resolution. It was a life which was different. A life had wrong turns and long divisions and chapters that didn't flow from each other, and characters who appeared and disappeared without the narrative coherence that stories required. A life had coincidence and accident, and the random fall of days that sometimes grouped themselves into something meaningful only in retrospect. But it also had porches, in rain, and soup from neighbors, and gardens, and the specific sound of the first rain of autumn on a tin roof, which you could return to year after year and find unchanged, find waiting, find exactly as you remembered, and also always slightly new. Chapter 11, 9 o'clock. The church bell 2 streets over struck 9. Its sound arriving through the rain, with that slightly softened quality that rain gave to all sounds, not muffled exactly, but gentled, the hard edges of the bell's tone given a kind of fuzziness by the water in the air, so that it sounded less declarative than it usually did, and more contemplative. 9 o'clock on a September evening. The world was quiet in the way of a weeknight in a small town in autumn, the particular quiet that comes when summer's extended socializing has given way to earlier evenings and drawn curtains and the private warm interiors of households. On the lane, no one walked. No children on bikes, no one out with their dogs, though she could hear, faintly, the Hendersons' retriever somewhere in the middle distance, clearly of the opinion that a little rain was no reason to curtail a perfectly good wander. The occasional car still passed, but with the purposeful air of cars that were going somewhere rather than drifting. Eleanor was not going anywhere. She had considered, at some point around 8:30, whether she ought to go inside, whether it was irresponsible to sit on the porch through the entire evening, whether there were things she should be doing, whether this was the kind of self-indulgence that should be rationed. She had examined this thought from a few angles, and then let it go. There was nothing waiting inside that required her attention that could not wait. The garden would not be worse for her staying here. The house would not notice. Nothing would be harmed by an evening spent on a porch in the rain, doing nothing more purposeful than witnessing. Witnessing, she had come to believe, was not nothing. There was a case to be made, not a grand, philosophical case, but a practical and human one. That witnessing was actually quite important. That someone needed to sit in the rain and pay attention to it. Not to document it, not to photograph it, not to record it for later. Just to be in its presence and note that it was happening. The rain did not require this. The rain would have fallen whether or not she was on the porch. The lane would have glistened. The maple would have lost its leaves. The creek would have begun, very slowly, to fill. None of it needed her witness to proceed, but she needed it. She needed to be the one doing the seeing, because seeing this, genuinely seeing it, with full attention and without agenda, was what kept her connected to something she could not name precisely, but which had to do with the realness of the world, the undeniable, ongoing, indifferent but not hostile reality of things going on as they had always gone on, and would go on, the season turning, the water falling, the year moving toward its close. It was grounding in the most literal sense. She was held by this porch and this rain to the ground. She poured the last of her tea, which was now barely warm, drank it anyway. Chapter 12. Things she knew about rain. She had preferred indoor autumn evenings as a child. She had been a cautious child in certain ways, not afraid of rain, but trained by her mother to come in before it properly started, to have the sense to get out of it. It had taken adulthood and her own house, and the discovery of a porch with a proper roof, to understand that rain could be something you lived alongside rather than something you waited out, that the experience of rain from a dry and sheltered place was entirely different from the experience of being caught in it. She had made this discovery incrementally over years, in the way that discoveries made by living rather than by instruction usually arrived, not as an insight, not as a moment of revelation, but as a slow accumulation of evenings on the porch, each one leaving her slightly better disposed toward the next one, each one demonstrating, in its particular way, that the rain had something to offer that clear evenings did not. The sound, primarily, but also the way rain changed your relationship to inside and outside, the way it drew a line, not a harsh line, not a wall, just a distinction, between the covered, sheltered space where you sat and the open, unsheltered world where it was falling. This distinction was the source of the porch's particular magic in rain. Inside the house, you were fully inside, separated from the weather by walls and roof and glass. The rain only audible, not smellable, not feelable. Outside in the rain, you were fully in it, no separation at all. But on the porch, you were in a third condition, present to the rain without being subject to it, witnessing without removal, sheltered without being isolated. This condition, she had come to feel, was not available to you in the same way any other time. It required the specific architecture of a covered outdoor space and the specific weather of rain. And when those two things coincided, the result was something she didn't have a proper word for, not comfort exactly, not peace exactly. Something in between that was also slightly more than either. She had tried to describe it to Daniel once. Sitting in these same chairs on a rainy evening some years before he died, and he had listened with the particular quality of listening he gave to things that he found genuinely interesting, not just politely interested, but actually interested. The slight lean forward, the absence of any hurry to respond. It's like being between two worlds, she had said, which had not been quite right. Like being allowed to see one world from the safety of the other, he had offered. Yes, she had said, more like that. He had nodded. The good observation deck quality. The good observation deck quality, she had agreed. She hadn't known then how many times she would sit here without him. She hadn't thought about it, which was the right way not to have thought about it. You couldn't live inside every moment of a life, also carrying the knowledge of how that moment would eventually feel in its absence. You just lived it. And then later, when you came back to it without the person who had been there with you, you carried both the living and the loss at once. And somehow, not easily, not without cost, but genuinely, both of those things could be in the same place without destroying each other. The love and the loss, both real, both present. The porch holding them both in its good porch way without distinction. She had lived through many rains, not as a philosophical position, but as a plain fact. 53 years of rains, a great many of them witnessed from this or other porches and windows and doorways, and under umbrellas and without umbrellas, and from the seat of a car, and from the inside of tents, and from the decks of ferries, and from every other vantage point that a life could offer. She had preferences. Her preference, specifically, was for rain at night. She could not fully explain this preference, except to say that rain at night seemed to her to be the rain in its most complete and authentic state. In the day, rain competed with other things. It interrupted plans. It complicated logistics. It required adjustment. It was visible in a way that made it primarily scenic, a backdrop to the ongoing drama of daily movement. But at night, rain was released from those duties. At night, it could simply be itself. Just the sound and the smell and the feel of it, the weight and the rhythm, the particular quality of darkness that it created. She liked the sound of it beginning, which was always slightly tentative and always became, in its own time, committed. The smell of it, which was different every time but recognizably itself. The underlying note that was always petrichor, always that mineral, ancient thing, overlaid with whatever the specific season and landscape added. Autumn rain smelled different from spring rain. Rain in a city smelled different from rain on a lane lined with maples. Rain on the ocean smelled entirely different from rain in a garden. The way it made light behave, the way it changed every light source, street lamps, into something luminous and slightly magical. Window lights into warm, blurred diamonds, the thin glow of a moon behind cloud cover into a general silver illumination without clear source. The rhythm of it, which was never quite steady, which always had variations, accelerations, quietenings, which was, she thought, part of why it was so easy to stay awake to, and also so easy to drift into sleep beside. It held you with its variability, and then soothed you with its continuity. It was both interesting and restful at once, which was a rare combination. She also knew things about rain that were less comfortable, but equally true. She knew that rain had its harder versions, that there were rains that came with cold fronts and driving wind, and which were not peaceful or atmospheric, but simply wet and unpleasant. That there were rains that flooded, that there were rains that lasted so long that the ground couldn't absorb them, and they became damaging. The same water that was beautiful in measured quantities becoming a problem in excess. She knew that rain was not inherently romantic or beautiful or comforting, that it was weather first, and that weather was indifferent, that the beauty was in the relation between the rain and the person experiencing it, between the rain and the specific context of shelter and season, and one's own particular interior state. Tonight's interior state, she thought, was well suited to tonight's rain. The two of them had found each other, as they sometimes did, at the right moment. She had been waiting, not anxiously, not impatiently, but with the open quality of waiting that was really just attention, for the first rain of the season. And the rain had arrived this evening at the exact moment when she was available to receive it properly. On the porch, with her tea and her blanket and her photograph album and her thoughts about Daniel and about gardens and about all the things that were gone and all the things that remained. She considered this something like grace, not in any formal religious sense, just the word for when things align, when the world's timing matches yours, or yours matches the world's, and the result is a moment that is simply, without remainder, right. Chapter 13. The Night Sky Hidden. She tried, once or twice, to see stars through the cloud cover. This was an old habit from childhood, from the summers she had spent at her grandmother's small house in the hills, where there were genuinely dark skies, the kind of dark skies that most people alive today had never experienced, the kind where the Milky Way was not a faint suggestion, but an actual feature of the night, where you could lie on your back in the grass and feel very clearly that you were on the surface of a planet, a small surface, a temporary surface, floating in something that went on in all directions without end. Her grandmother had known the constellations. She had taught them to Eleanor one at a time over the course of many summers, not from a book, not as a lesson, but as a running commentary on whatever was overhead on a given night. That's Cassiopeia, the queen. Do you see how she's sitting? That's Cygnus, the swan. Follow those 3 stars. There's its neck. There's the wing. That one, that very bright one, do you see? That's not a star at all. That's Saturn. You can tell because it doesn't twinkle. Planets don't twinkle. She had not been a grandmother who made grand claims about the meaning of stars. She had not suggested that the constellations were watching over them, or that the stars had messages, or that the universe was interested in their particular welfare. She had simply shared what she knew, named things, pointed, turned Eleanor's face toward the sky with a gentle hand. Look, there, see. The gift of that was not the specific knowledge, which Eleanor retained only partially and with diminishing accuracy, and which she never applied in any practical way. The gift was the posture, the understanding that looking at the sky was worth doing, that lifting your eyes from the immediate was valuable, that the immediate was not, in fact, everything. tonight the sky was entirely hidden. Solid, low ceiling of cloud that you could tell, even in the dark, was dense and continuous, that had moved in from the west with the rain, and showed no sign of moving out. The stars were behind it. She knew they were there, Cassiopeia and Saturn, and the whole incomprehensible show. But she couldn't see them, and she wasn't going to tonight. This was fine. She had learned in recent years that the hidden things were still there, that you didn't need continuous visible evidence of something for it to remain real. The stars behind the cloud cover were no less real for being invisible. The creek running in the dark at the edge of hearing was no less real for being inaudible when the rain was louder. And the people you had loved, who were not there on the porch beside you, they were no less real for their physical absence. The things that mattered remained real, whether you could currently see them or not. She held this thought with the particular care you give thoughts that have been hard won, thoughts that arrived not as insights, but as slow accumulations of experience, building themselves over years until one day you noticed they were there. Then she let it rest. The rain continued. Chapter 14. The history of this porch. The porch had been here before her. This was easy to forget and worth remembering. She had not built this porch. She had merely lived on it for 25 years now, and in that living, she had come to feel that she knew it thoroughly and that it knew her. But it had been here before her arrival on Millbrook Lane, built by whoever had built this house. In whatever year that was, she knew it was sometime in the 1920s, but couldn't have said more precisely. And it had been here through all the people who had lived in the house between its construction and her tenancy. She liked to think about this occasionally. The Marchellas had lived here before Eleanor and Daniel. She knew this because their name was still sometimes on pieces of mail that arrived, and because Mrs. Henderson, 2 doors down, had lived on the lane for 30 years and had mentioned them occasionally. They had a daughter who used to visit in the summers. There was a cat named something Italian. They had kept tomatoes in the garden bed that was now Eleanor's lavender hedge. She imagined them on this porch. Some summer evening, some autumn rain, some January morning when the lane was white and silent, and the porch was the only dry place to stand and look at it. Before the Marchellas, there had been someone else. Before that, someone else. Back through the decades, back through the years when the lane had had fewer houses on it and more trees, when the maples had been smaller, when the village itself had been smaller and slower, and differently oriented toward the wider world. All of those people had lived in this house. Some of them had sat on this porch. Some of them had watched rain. It was a peculiar thought, and she wasn't sure what to do with it except hold it the way you held an interesting stone, not for any purpose, just because the weight and texture of it was interesting. This porch was a place that had accumulated human time. The wood had been sat on, and leaned on and paced and stood and breathed on through decades, through generations. The tin roof had conducted its steady percussion over the heads of many different people, in many different states of mind and heart. She had contributed her portion. 25 autumns, roughly 25 first rains of the season, received from this porch, each one slightly different in temperature and timing and intensity, and her own interior state at the moment of receiving. Her portion of this porch's history was not insignificant, but it was not the whole story, and she liked that. She liked that she was not the whole story, that the porch had been here before her, and would likely be here after her, well-maintained, lovingly cared for, needing a new board on the far left that she'd been meaning to attend to for 2 years, and that whatever history it accumulated in her absence would be its own, would be someone else's portion, would be someone else's first rain of autumn. She hoped they would be good at witnessing. She hoped whoever came after her would sit in the rain and not feel they needed to be anywhere else. Chapter 15, 9:30. The rain was still falling. Steady, consistent, committed, the kind of autumn rain that had settled in for the night and intended to be here in the morning too. Still raining when she woke. Still raining when she made her coffee. Still raining when she went out in her boots to check the garden with the particular proprietorial air she always had after a significant rainfall, wanting to assess, to see what had been received and what had been perhaps too much for the tender things. But that was tomorrow. Tonight it was 9:30, and the lane was quiet, and the rain was steady, and Eleanor was in her wicker chair under the blanket with her hands in her lap, and nothing on her mind in any pressing sense. Just the pleasant, generative quality of a mind that has been given an evening to do nothing in particular, and has therefore done rather a lot, in the private, unmeasurable, not quite thinking way that is actually the thing minds do best. She had thought about Daniel, and about the garden, and about Margaret Calloway, and about the history of the porch, and about her grandmother's stars, and about rain on different surfaces, and about the creek filling in the dark beyond the willows, and about what it meant to witness, and about the 22 years that were behind her and the years that were ahead of her, and the particular quality of this present moment, which was not perfect, which was too closed a word, but whole, sufficient, entire in its own terms. She had thought about all of this without intending to think about any of it, without agenda or direction, just the mind in its natural state when given enough quiet and enough time and enough real thing to look at. This was, she thought, the return on investment of the porch, of evenings like this. She didn't think of it as productivity. The word made her tired even now. But there was something in it that was deeply useful, in the sense of useful to being a person, to being, specifically, this person, to keeping herself in some kind of alignment with what was real and what mattered and what she actually felt, rather than what she was supposed to feel, or what she had been feeling last week, or what she would need to feel next week. She had spent a significant portion of her 40s, she now thought, in a state of mild, persistent misalignment. Not unhappiness. She had not been unhappy, but there had been a subtle gap between the life she was living and the life she was inhabiting. A distinction that probably sounded precious, but felt, in her experience, quite concrete. You could live a life technically, go through its motions, make its decisions, fulfill its requirements, while not quite inhabiting it, not quite being present in it, in the full-bodied, full-attention way that made the difference between a life witnessed from the inside and a life administered from a slight distance. She had been a good administrator. She was, by profession, a librarian, had been for 28 years. At the small public library in the village, 3 miles from the lane. She was deeply fond of the library, genuinely committed to its particular form of public good, attached to the community of regular readers, and the occasional first-time visitors, and the children who came in on Tuesday afternoons for reading hour, and who were, as a group, among the most honest and least self-conscious audience she had ever had for anything. She had been good at her work, methodical and warm and possessed of the kind of institutional knowledge that a small public library required, knowing who would enjoy what, knowing when to recommend, and when to simply make available, knowing the difference between the person who needed the novel and the person who needed the biography and the person who didn't know what they needed and required a different kind of help. But the years in the library had also required a kind of being on, a sustained social availability that was not exactly performance, but was also not quite rest. And she had learned over time that this meant she needed the porch the way some people needed the gym, or the meditation class, or the long early morning run, as the necessary other side of the day's coin, the place where she could be entirely without function, where nothing was required of her, and nothing was offered from a place of effort, where she was just a person on a covered wooden structure in the dark with the rain, paying attention to what was actually there. This was not the opposite of her working life. It was its foundation. Without the porch evenings, she would have been a less good librarian, less present to the people who came in, less genuinely interested. And she was genuinely interested, always had been. That wasn't performance, but the genuine interest required replenishment, required the reservoir to be filled, required evenings like this one where the world gave, and she received without the transaction being complicated by anything else. Right now she felt, and the feeling was real and earned and present, something that she would call, for want of a better word, well, not the false wellness of distraction, not the performed wellness of someone assuring others they're fine, but the genuine, grounded, bodily wellness of a woman who has spent a September evening on her porch in the first rain of autumn, eating her neighbor's soup, looking at her photographs, listening to the creek returning to itself in the dark, feeling the weight of a familiar cardigan on her shoulders and a blanket on her lap, and nothing in her heart that required immediate action. The world was in its September mood, and she was in hers, and they had met here, on this porch, and agreed that this was a good place to be. Chapter 16. What the Rain Was Washing. There was an old idea she had encountered somewhere. She couldn't remember where, possibly in something she had read, possibly in something someone had said on a forgettable evening, that had stuck in the inexplicable way that certain things stuck. That rain was a cleaning agent in a deeper sense than the purely physical. That it didn't only clean the air of pollen and dust and the particular olfactory residue of hot weather, but cleaned something else too, something in the psychic or emotional register, if those words didn't sound too much like something from a wellness magazine. She had always been skeptical of the easy metaphors, of the idea that natural things had purely symbolic meaning assigned by human interpretation. That rain was always about renewal and fire, always about passion, and the sea always about the unconscious. Those correspondences were too tidy, too confident, too uninterested in the thing itself. But sitting here, watching the rain do what it did, she thought there was something in the idea, not as metaphor, not as symbol, but as fact, as literal bodily fact. She felt cleaner, not in the physical sense, she hadn't been in the rain, but something had shifted over the course of this evening that she could only describe as a kind of clearing. The same kind of clearing that came after a good night's sleep, after a long walk, after a conversation that had gotten to the real thing. A clarity, a reduction of accumulated weight. She thought about all the small things she had been carrying, the appointment she had been putting off making, the email she had been drafting in her head for 3 days, the question of whether to repaint the kitchen, which had been somehow unresolvable for 6 months despite being, in the grand scheme of things, entirely trivial. The unspecified unease that had sat with her through most of the previous week, like a slightly uninvited guest who wouldn't quite leave. The mild but persistent loneliness of Tuesday afternoons, which was the time of the week she had always found the hardest since Daniel, for reasons she had never been able to fully identify. She had been carrying all of these things in the way you carry things you haven't consciously put down, just always there, just always a slight additional weight. And now, on the porch in the rain, somehow the weight of them had reduced. Not resolved, not gone. The appointment still needed to be made. The email would still require writing. The kitchen was still unpainted and would remain so for some indefinite future period. None of the actual facts had changed, but something about the quality of holding them had changed. The rain had been falling on her evening for several hours now, and in that time, the accumulated tension of a normal week of being a person had simply eased, the way a muscle eases after a sustained stretch, not dramatically, not completely, but noticeably, a reduction in the holding. She breathed out, slowly, felt her shoulders settle, listened to the rain on the roof. The robin had long since gone to wherever robins went at night. The lane was still, the few visible lights burning with the steady, uncomplicated warmth of houses inhabited by sleeping or reading people. The maple at the edge of the yard stood in the rain with the patience of a maple in rain, enormous, quiet, its leaves releasing at whatever rate the rain and wind and season dictated, no faster and no slower than was right. She thought about the Japanese maple in the garden. By mid-October, it would be a different thing entirely. The incremental change she had seen tonight, those first hints of copper in the outermost leaves, would have completed itself, would have moved through the entire canopy, and the tree would stand in full autumn regalia. That extraordinary color that contained red and orange and bronze, all at once, that seemed lit from within. She had photographs of it from previous years, could have told you what it would look like in advance, but she could never quite remember the visceral reality of it until she was standing in front of it in October. And then she was always stopped by it, always made still. The garden's calendar was more reliable than any appointment book. The peonies came in late May, always. The lavender followed in June. The foxgloves in late June into July. The roses in their various waves through summer. The ornamental grasses tasseling in August. The asters in September. The Japanese maple's performance in October. And then the long quiet of November through March, when the structure of things was revealed. The bare bones of the garden, the forms beneath the foliage, the skeleton that was always there, but usually hidden, and which she had come, over many years, to find beautiful in its own right. The garden had a patience she was still learning from. It didn't rush. It didn't try to have its October moment in June. It came to each thing in the right sequence, at the right time, doing what the season called for and resting when rest was called for, not anxious about the transitions, not trying to hold onto summer or hurry through winter. Just moving through, just being what it was when it was, fully and without apology. She was trying to learn this. She was, she thought, getting better at it. Chapter 17. The rain slows. Around 10 o'clock, the rain began to ease. Not to stop, not yet, not completely, but to relax into a lighter version of itself. The steady, full commitment rain of the past several hours gave way to something more tentative, more intermittent. Patches of intensity followed by near pauses where the roof barely registered the drops, and then a return to lightness, and then another near pause. She could hear this change. The roof, which had been providing its reliable, continuous percussion, now varied drumming, and then barely whispering, and then drumming again. the rhythm becoming less insistent, more questioning. The sound in the maple tree changed too, the rapid rattle of rain on leaves giving way to the slower, individual dripping of gathered water from branch tips to lower branches to ground. That secondary rain that goes on after the primary rain has stopped. Each gathered drop eventually released. The tree slowly returning the water it has temporarily held. The smell changed. In the first hours of rain, the smell had been all about newness, petrichor, and ozone, and the sharp, bright quality of the world receiving water after drought. Now, as the rain eased, the smell deepened, became more complex. The soil had been thoroughly wetted and was releasing its own deep mineral smell. The vegetation, the grasses and leaves and remaining summer-end flowers, was giving off something greener, something alive-smelling, the smell of growth and of processes continuing. It was a richer smell than the beginning smell, with more layers, more depth, more of the world in it. She sat with this transition. The easing of rain, she had always thought, was one of the undervalued pleasures. People noticed when rain began. The first drops always attracted attention, always produced some small response. Looking up, looking out, the small rearrangement of plans or expectations. And people noticed when rain stopped properly. The silence it left, the particular quality of after-rain air. But the easing itself, this gradual, unhurried process of rain becoming less rain, and then less rain still, and then something barely distinguishable from the ambient moisture of a wet garden. This was easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. She was paying attention. She noticed the way the sound changed in not just one register, but in many simultaneously. The high, rapid notes of the heaviest drops on the tin roof became less frequent, the gaps between them growing from fractions of seconds to actual, appreciable silences. The lower, fuller sound of rain in the garden, in the leaves and soil, and on the stone path stayed longer. That level sustaining itself even as the primary rain diminished, as if the garden were still in conversation with a rain that was technically already winding down. She noticed the visual change too. The curtain of rain at the edge of the porch roof, that almost transparent veil she had watched since early evening, had thinned. It was no longer a true curtain, no longer a continuous moving wall of water. It was more like a scatter now, like the last page of a chapter where the paragraphs grow shorter and the white space grows larger. The individual drops were still visible against the pale glow of the porch light, but they were fewer, and between them were gaps of clear air. And through those gaps, the lane was more visible, the wet pavement, the maple trunks, the light from the street lamp more defined than it had been for hours, the edges of things returning. There was something naturally meditative about watching something ease. The way you felt watching a busy road at midnight when the traffic finally thinned. The way you felt at the end of a long day when the noise of it stopped. The easing was not only about the rain. It was also about the evening, about her own body's quiet acknowledgement that the hour was late and the day was done, and the very good and necessary business of deep rest was beginning to make its case. She was not sleepy exactly. She was at that threshold, the place where you are still fully present, but the presence has a quality of softness to it, of reduced resistance, the way the air feels right before the last light of day gives way to genuine dark. She thought about something her grandmother had said once, on one of those summer evenings in the hills when the dark sky was out and they were lying on the grass looking up at it. She had been asking, she was perhaps 10, perhaps 11, why they couldn't stay up all night, since the sky was there all night and you could only see it when it was dark, and the dark was precious. Her grandmother had said, without much pause, "The sky is always there. You'll have other nights, but you won't enjoy them if you're tired, and you won't be fully awake for them if you don't sleep. A good night's sleep is what makes the next night with the sky worth having." She had thought this was a terrible answer at the time. She thought now that it was, quietly and without ceremony, exactly right. Her hands lay open in her lap. Her breathing had slowed without her doing anything to slow it. The blanket was warm, and the porch was cool, and the rain was gentle now. A whisper, barely more than presence. She thought about going inside. She thought about it the way you think about inevitable things, not with resistance or reluctance, but with a kind of growing readiness. The porch had given her everything it had to give this evening, and she had received everything she was capable of receiving. And now, the natural movement was toward the house, and toward rest, and toward the long, dark, quiet hours of sleep in which the day would be sorted and filed and integrated in whatever way the sleeping mind did that processing. She stayed a little longer, just a little, just enough to feel the last of it. Chapter 18. The last light of the evening. The street light at the corner was still on. It would be on all night, doing its modest job of illuminating the wet lane for anyone who might need it. It didn't matter whether anyone did. It was just what the light did, as the rain was just what the rain did, as the maple was just what the maple did. Continued, reliably, in its own nature. She could see the lane from where she sat, though the light was barely enough to define it. A stretch of dark, glistening pavement. The black outlines of the maple, trunks against the slightly less dark sky. The pale glimmer of the old stone wall at the Callaway boundary. A curtain moved in a house further down the lane. Someone checking the weather, perhaps, or just awake late and looking out. The way people looked out of windows on rainy nights, drawn by some old instinct to check the world's condition. She felt a warmth toward that moving curtain and toward whoever had moved it. All the lit windows along the lane, and all the quiet houses, and all the people in them, sleeping or reading or making tea, or lying awake with their particular late-night thoughts. She felt a warmth toward all of them. The accumulated warmth of a good evening, of soup and photographs and rain, and the strange and gentle company of your own thoughts, properly attended to. Millbrook Lane was full of lives. She had known this abstractly for years, and known it more personally for the 5 or 6 households she interacted with regularly. Margaret Calloway, the Hendersons, the young couple who had moved into the Blackwood house last spring with their baby and their enormous calm dog. But the lane contained lives beyond those. The older man at the far end who kept bees, and who she had spoken to perhaps 6 times in 25 years, but who always acknowledged her on the lane with a nod of genuine recognition. The family in the converted farmhouse near the creek, whose children she had watched grow from small and noisy to somewhat larger and somewhat less noisy over the past decade. The woman who walked very early in the mornings, before anyone was properly awake, with her 2 gray dogs and her yellow coat, and whom Eleanor had never met, but whose rhythm she had absorbed into her own sense of the lane's character. All of them under the rain. All of them in their houses, in their evenings, in their lives. None of them aware of being thought of by the woman on the porch at number 14. She let the thought rest there, all of it, the full warmth of it. And then she did what the evening required. She stood. Her joints registered their opinion of the late hour, and the cool air and the wicker chair, and she acknowledged their opinion with the mild, untroubled acknowledgement of someone who has long since stopped expecting her body to behave as if she were 35. She gathered the blanket and folded it over her arm. She picked up her mug and the photograph album. She looked out one more time at the lane and the rain and the maple and the garden. The Japanese maple stood in the corner of the east bed, its first hints of copper barely visible in the darkness. By October, she thought, by October it will be extraordinary. She turned toward the door. Chapter 19. The House at Night. The house received her. That was how it felt on evenings when she had been outside for a long time and came back in. The house received her. The warmth and the particular smell of it books and lemon verbena, and the faint vanilla of the candle she had burned earlier and let go out, wrapping around her like something intentional. She set the blanket on the basket by the door. She took off her shoes. She stood for a moment in the hallway in her stocking feet, just being inside, just feeling the different quality of the air, warmer, stiller, carrying the small interior history of the day's activities. The kitchen was as she had left it, the bowl washed and drying. The photograph album went back on its shelf, gently, with a pause before she let it go. She turned off the light in the living room. She turned off the porch light. Through the front door's glass panel, she could see the lane in the darkness, the street light, the wet pavement, the rain now very light, barely more than mist. She watched it for a moment. Then she went to the kitchen, filled a glass with water cool from the tap, the taste of her particular water in her particular place, and drank half of it standing at the sink, looking out the kitchen window at the garden. In the dark, the garden was shapes and textures. The tall forms of the foxgloves against the fence, the rounded mass of the lavender hedge, the reaching branches of the Japanese maple. She knew its geography so thoroughly that she could have named each thing even in complete darkness. There is Henry, there are the peonies, there is the ornamental grass, there is the stone bench he carried from the truck. She set the glass down, turned off the kitchen light. The house was quiet. She went up the stairs, her hand light on the familiar banister, each stair familiar under her feet. The night sounds came with her, the occasional drip from the eaves outside, the settling sounds of a house in autumn, the barely audible continuation of the rain on the roof that she could hear even up here, muted now. The roof, above this floor, being shingles rather than tin, but still present, still there. The bedroom was cool. She had opened the window slightly before going outside and hadn't closed it, and the night air had come through and made the room cold in the pleasant, deliberate way of a room that has been aired. She closed the window most of the way, leaving it open just a crack, just enough to let the sounds of the rain continue. She moved through the getting ready for sleep motions with the quiet efficiency of someone who has done this 10,000 times. The washing of face and hands, the small ceremony of things put away, the glass of water on the bedside table for the middle of the night. She got into bed. The sheets were cool. She pulled the duvet up and lay for a moment on her back, feeling the bed receive her weight, feeling the cool shift to warmth as her body heat began to fill the space. The rain. She could still hear it just through the window's small opening. The lightest sound, barely a murmur, barely there. The rain was nearly over for tonight. It would probably stop sometime in the small hours, and she would sleep through the stopping. And in the morning the world would be the world after rain, clean and brightened, every color deepened by the wetness, every surface reflective, the air carrying the specific post-rain smell that was different from the rain smell in the way that the morning after an important event is different from the event itself, quieter, clearer, possessed of a particular stillness. But that was the morning. Right now it was raining. Just barely, just enough. Chapter 20, the first night. She lay in the dark and let herself drift. Not toward sleep, not quite yet, not quite at the threshold, but toward the territory before sleep, the soft territory where the thoughts became slower and less logical and more associative, where images arose without being summoned, where the day began its quiet processing. She thought about the single leaf she had watched fall from the maple at the edge of the yard. The first leaf, the way it had turned in the air, moved by the first drops of rain before it hit the stone path. Such a small thing, such a precise and particular small thing, that leaf, that turn, that path, that evening. There is an argument to be made, not a grand argument, not a philosophical treatise, that the specific is what saves us, not the general, not the universal, not the large and abstract comforts of knowing that many people have gone through difficult things and come out the other side. Those comforts were real, but they were not the thing that actually reached you at the bottom of a hard night. What reached you was the specific robin on the specific bird, bath in the specific garden, on the specific evening of the specific first rain of autumn, in the specific year you happened to be living. The specific warmth of the wool that had been his and was now yours. The specific smell of the soup that Margaret had made from the specific last leaks of her specific garden. The specific sound of the bell from 2 streets over striking 9, and the specific quality of that sound through rain, the way the edges of the bell tone went soft in the wet air. The specific person in the specific chair, breathing the specific September night air. This person, this chair, this night. She had been given this, and she had received it, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything that this particular evening had had to give, and she had given it her full attention in return. And that exchange, that simple, ancient exchange between a person and the particular world they inhabit, was what she would carry forward. Into sleep, into the morning, into October, which was coming with its copper and crimson and its long, still afternoons, into all the seasons that remained. She thought about Margaret Calloway's lemon cake 25 years ago, on the day she and Daniel had arrived at Millbrook Lane. She thought about the way the lane had looked then, through a first-time pair of eyes, unfamiliar, full of potential, slightly daunting in the specific way of all new beginnings. She thought about how you could not have told that person, that younger Eleanor with her unlanded garden and her unfamiliar lane, all that those years would contain. You could not have told her about Henry the rosebush, or the Japanese maple, or the stone bench, or the shoebox in the desk, or the 3 years of learning to carry something you had not expected to carry so soon and had carried anyway. Because what else do? You just carry it. You just keep going. And eventually, it was true. It was actually true. Against all reasonable expectation, it was true. Eventually, carrying becomes something more than endurance, becomes something you might, in certain lights, in certain September evenings, call a life her own, fully, with all of it in it. She thought about Margaret coming back down the porch steps in the rain, raising her hand at the gate. She thought about Daniel on the May porch, turning the pages of the album with care. She thought about the single copper leaf on the stone path. She thought about the creek running in the dark, beyond the willows, beyond the valley, doing what it did, going on. The way everything went on, the way she went on. She felt herself at the edge of sleep. She thought about the robin on the bird bath, dipping its beak. She thought about the sound of the creek in the dark. She thought about Daniel on that May evening, turning the pages of the photograph album with care, saying very little, which had always been his way with things that had meaning for him. A kind of respectful quiet, an acknowledgement that spoke through attention rather than words. She thought about the Japanese maple and its first hints of copper and what it would look like in October. She thought about the lane in the rain, the glistening of it, the way the street light made the drops visible as they fell through its beam. She thought about the year turning quietly, without drama, the season releasing its long summer hold and beginning the journey toward winter through the most beautiful country it knew, through amber and crimson and bronze and gold, through the smell of wood smoke beginning, and apples ripening and mornings that arrived cool and clear and particular. She thought about all of this without urgency, without needing it to mean anything beyond what it was, without needing to resolve it or file it or draw conclusions. It was simply the day being laid down. The rain, very quiet now, almost nothing, just the faintest of sounds, barely a whisper on the roof, barely a murmur through the barely open window. The last of the night's rain, spending itself gently as it had begun. She felt herself at the edge of sleep, not falling. That was always the wrong word for it. Not falling, but softening, the way a candle flame softens in the moment before it goes out. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but with a gradual reduction, a gentle releasing of the light. She was not afraid of the dark. She had learned, through some of the hardest evenings of her life, that the dark was simply what was there when the light went. Not threatening, not empty, just the dark with its own qualities, its own textures, its own way of holding you. The dark of a house at night was full of familiar sounds and familiar smells, and the familiar weight of the duvet and the familiar coolness of the pillow. The dark was home, too. She breathed. In, out. The rain very, very faint now, so light it was almost indistinguishable from the natural sounds of the house. Outside, on the porch where she had sat all evening, the wicker chair received the last of the night's rain. The photograph album was inside, safe. The soup bowl was washed and drying. The first leaf of autumn lay on the stone path, held flat against it by the wet, dark with moisture, the color of an old coin. In the garden, the Japanese maple was beginning, one leaf at a time, its slow and beautiful change. In the lane, the maple trees were beginning theirs. The creek was running in the dark, refilling after the long, dry summer, doing what creeks do when rain comes. And Eleanor Marsh was in her bed, in her house, on her lane, in her September, in her life. Eyes closed, breathing slowing, the day settling into its proper distance. The evening she had becoming the evening she would carry. The sound of the first autumn rain becoming a sound she would remember, the way she remembered all the important quiet things. The season had arrived. She had been here to to receive it. Now she could rest. Chapter 21. While she slept. While Eleanor slept, the rain continued for a while, and then stopped. It stopped sometime around 2 in the morning, which was a time she didn't experience, a time that existed for her only in the gap between going to sleep and waking up, in the way that all the small hours existed, unmeasured, unnamed, just the dark body of the night doing its private work. The rain stopped, and the clouds began to thin, not immediately, slowly, in the way that weather changes when it is not in a hurry, moving in patches and increments, a thinning here and a parting there, the cloud layer becoming less solid, less uniform, and through those first thin places the stars appeared. Not all at once, one at a time, a pin of light where the cloud had cleared, then another, then 3 together, then a whole patch of sky in which 12 or 20 stars were suddenly visible, their light arriving through the cleared air with a steadiness and a clarity that was entirely different from their appearance through cloud, sharper, more definite, more themselves. By 3 in the morning, the sky above Millbrook Lane was half clear. The stars appeared over the maple trees, over the apple trees, over the garden where the Japanese maple stood in its first tentative copper, over the stone wall that had been there since 1890, over the church bell tower 2 streets over Margaret Calloway's house with its amber lamp, now extinguished, over the Hendersons' fence, over the house at number 14 where Eleanor slept. The lane was very quiet, the kind of quiet that only existed after rain, after midnight, when the last of the late walkers had gone home and the earliest of the early risers had not yet begun. A quality of quiet that had texture, not the absence of sound, but a particular presence of silence that was its own thing, that was different from daytime quiet or evening quiet in ways that were hard to name, but unmistakable to anyone who had been awake in it. The stone path outside Eleanor's front door held puddles that reflected the stars. In the garden, everything was wet and settled. The foxgloves had gathered drops along their stems and on the spotted inner surfaces of their blooms. The lavender was sodden and dark, its fragrance intensified by the rain, and now moving in a low, slow wave across the garden whenever the lightest breeze passed through. Henry the rosebush stood with the patient dignity of something that had been doing this for a long time and planned to keep doing it. The stone bench held a mirror of sky. On the east side of the garden, the Japanese maple had not changed much in the hours since Eleanor had last looked at it. The copper hints were still only hints, still only a suggestion, still only the first page of a story that would take several weeks to tell. But they were there. They were real. By morning, they would be slightly more. Chapter 22. The lane in the small hours. Somewhere down the lane, a cat made a sound. Brief, conversational, directed at something, another cat, a fox passing through, some movement in the wet grass that warranted comment. The sound carried through the rain-cleared air with unusual clarity, a small bright note in the general silence, and then was gone. A fox passed through. She the fox, a young one, the color of old rust, with white-tipped tail and precise, careful feet, moved along the edge of the Calloway property, and through a gap she had long since mapped in the stone wall, moving through the lane's nighttime as if she owned it, which in one sense she did. She paused at the base of the lamp post to check something in the air, nose up, utterly still, reading the world, and then moved on, disappearing around the curve of the lane with the particular disappearing quality of foxes, which was more like becoming part of the dark than moving out of it. The lane was hers. The stars were out. The maple at the edge of Eleanor's yard stood in the starlight with its copper-tinged leaves, and the stone bench in the garden held its small mirror of sky, and the robin that had been on the bird bath was in its roost somewhere in the hedge, sleeping in the dense, interior way that small birds slept, metabolisms running fast and warm through the cool autumn night. Everything was resting. Everything was at the place of rest that came after the exertion of change. The creek was running. In the dark at the bottom of the valley, through the willows and the alders, the Millbrook was moving again with a sound that was fuller than it had been in months. The summer's drought reversed in a single night. The creek doing what it had always done when the autumn rains began, filling, deepening, widening slightly, reclaiming its banks, becoming again what it had been before the dry. The sound of it was too far to hear from the lane, but it was there, going on in the dark. Chapter 23. Just before morning. At the particular hour just before dawn, that hour that felt unlike any other, that had a quality of suspension to it, as if the night were taking a very long breath before releasing it into day. The lane was perfectly still, not silent, never quite silent, but still, the kind of stillness that contained within it all the future movement and sound and change that the day would bring, that held it in potential, that had not yet begun to release it. The stars were out in force now. Whatever clouds remained had moved north and east, chased by the front that had brought the rain. And the sky above Millbrook Lane was the sky as it genuinely was dense with stars. The Milky Way a suggestion, rather than a statement in the light-polluted sky of a small town. But there, present, the faintest shimmer of the galaxies near Arm, running roughly north to south above the maple trees. In Eleanor's room, she turned slightly in her sleep, not waking, just moving as the body moves in the night, finding its next comfortable position, resettling, continuing the long rest. The duvet rose and fell. The window was still open just a crack, and through it came the cool, after-rain air of the very early morning, pure and cold. and carrying the smell of wet earth and wet leaves, and the particular cleanness of air that has been thoroughly washed. It moved through the room gently, stirring nothing, just present, just a reminder that the world outside was still there, still itself, still going on in the way it went on. In the garden, the Japanese maple stood in the starlight. In the lane, the maples stood in the starlight. In the valley, the creek moved in the dark. Chapter 24, Morning Coming. The first light came not with drama, but with a slow, definite brightening of the east, a graying of the darkness that was so gradual that there was no single moment you could point to and say, "There, that is where the night ended." The night dissolved rather than departed, the darkness thinning from deep blue-black through charcoal, through the particular blue-gray of very early morning. And in that gray, the shapes of things became visible again. The outline of the maple, the curve of the lane, the roof of the Calloway house, the stone wall, all of them returning from their overnight absence into the legible world. A bird. One bird, she couldn't have said what kind from inside the room, but it was a high, clear sound, single notes with spaces between them. Not yet the full morning chorus, just one voice beginning before the others, testing the air. Then another. Then more. The morning chorus built the way the rain had built the night before. Slowly, from one source to many, from something barely audible to something full and complex and layered. Each voice adding its particular note to something that was becoming, very quickly, unmistakably, morning. In Eleanor's room, the light was just beginning to gray the edges of the curtains. She slept on. Not for much longer. She had always been an early waker, her body having developed, over decades of early gardening, an internal alarm that was relatively impervious to late nights. But for a little longer, for a little more of the deep rest that the night had produced, the rest that came when the body and mind had both been given what they needed, enough stillness, enough warmth, enough of the quiet work of sleeping. The day was beginning. The first rain of autumn was over. The garden was waiting, wet and settled, every leaf holding its silver of water, the lavender dark and heavy, the foxgloves dripping, Henry the rosebush beaded, the stone path gleaming, the stone bench still holding its sky, the Japanese maple standing in the first gray light of morning with its first copper showing. Eleanor slept. Chapter 25. The morning she would wake into. She would wake, when she woke, to a particular quality of morning light. Not the flat, neutral light of an ordinary September morning. Not the light that came after a clear night, but the special light that followed rain. Every surface slightly reflective, every color deeper than usual, the world having received its cleaning, and now offering itself at its most vivid, its most itself, she would look out the window before she got up. She always did. A habit so old she no longer noticed it. A reaching for the day before entering it. And she would see the garden in this light. And she would lie there a moment longer in the warmth and the particular satisfaction of seeing the garden the morning after rain. She would get up and put on her robe and go downstairs, moving through the cool house with the unhurried certainty of someone moving through familiar space in a familiar body. And she would fill the kettle and put it on. And while it heated, she would stand at the kitchen window and look at the garden properly. The Japanese maple would be there. Its copper would be real, and more than it had been the night before. A little further along the slow journey of its change, a little more of its October self visible in its September self, a little more of what it was becoming legible in what it still was. She would not be able to say exactly what had changed or measure it in any precise way. She would just know, with the gardener's particular knowledge that comes from long attention, that things had moved. She would take her coffee to the porch. She always took her coffee to the porch. She would sit in the same wicker chair in the morning light, with the garden before her and the lane beyond, and the maple at the edge, and the stone bench still slightly damp, and the stone path clean and clear, and the whole yard freshened, opened, given back to itself by the night's rain. And she would sit and drink her coffee and watch the morning arrive. She would not know how to describe what she felt. It would be too particular for description, too specific to this morning, and this lane, and this garden, and this body, in this chair, in this life. She would not try to describe it. She would just feel it cleanly, without translation. A good feeling, a real one, the particular satisfaction of having been present for something, for the season changing, for the rain arriving, for the first night of autumn doing what the first night of autumn did, which was announce that something was over and something was beginning, and that both of those things were all right, that both of those things were, in fact, more than all right. The maple would be changing. The creek would be running. The birds would be singing. Margaret Calloway would be in her garden later, in her waterproof hat and gloves, assessing what the rain had done and making plans in the decisive way she made all plans, probably already thinking about the leeks she would plant next year in better quantities. The lane would be there. The houses would be there. The people in them would be there, waking into their own particular September mornings, their own particular lives. Eleanor would be there too, on the porch, with her coffee, watching. Chapter 26. The Lantern in the Garden. But that was the morning, and the morning had not come yet. Right now, in the last hour before dawn, the lane was still, the birds not yet fully themselves, the sky still holding the last of the night in its western quarter. And in the garden, in the corner where the Japanese maple stood, something caught what little light there was and held it. just the drops on the leaves, just the water gathered in the curves of the small, delicate leaves, each one holding a bead of the night's rain. And in those beads, in that gathered water, reflecting the last of the stars and the very first gray of the not yet dawn, a kind of illumination, very small, very quiet, not visible from the road, not visible from the lane, barely visible from the bedroom window if you pressed your face to the glass. But there, real, the garden's quiet lantern. Eleanor was sleeping, and she didn't know this. She didn't see it. But it was happening in her garden, on her September morning, in the space between night and day. The tree she had planted as a small tentative thing 8 years ago, now standing in the last starlight of the year's first autumn night, catching the light in its new copper leaves, holding the rain of the first autumn rain in its thousands of small cups, and making from those ingredients starlight and rainwater and copper leaf, something that was very close to beautiful. It did this without her, as all the best things continued to do, all the time, in all the gardens. It simply was what it was, beautiful and unwitnessed and real, waiting for morning, waiting for her. Chapter 27. The last quiet. The last quiet of the night was settling now. It was that particular brief quiet that was not the silence of midnight or the silence of 3 a.m., but something else, a held-breath quality, a sense of the world pausing at the very edge of something, as if the whole lane and the whole sky and the whole valley with its rerunning creek were collectively holding still for just a moment before the next thing, before the morning, before the birds, before Eleanor's alarm clock. Not an alarm, actually. She never used an alarm, but the light that came through the curtains and the body that had learned to meet it did what it did. Before the coffee, before the porch, before October, which was coming, before the Japanese maples' full transformation, before all the mornings that were coming in their season, in their order, in the slow and beautiful turning of another year through its material, through leaf change and bare branch, and the first snow, and then the first crocus, and then the first warmth, and then the long green summer, and then the first rain of autumn again, waiting, always arriving. In the room upstairs, Eleanor breathed, slowly, easily. The rain was over. The rain had done its work. The garden was full of rain's work, every root drinking, every leaf rinsed, every crack in the stone path holding its small, bright mirror of sky. In the morning she would see it. She would stand in the kitchen and see the light on the garden, and she would feel what she felt, which was something real and not quite nameable, and hers. But right now she was sleeping, and the night was quiet, and the season had turned its first page, and everything that needed to happen had happened, quietly, in its own time, in the dark, while no one was watching. The way important things often do. The rain has stopped. The lane is still. The maple is beginning its color. The creek is running. Eleanor is asleep. And the morning that is coming will be the morning after the first rain of autumn, which is a morning with its own particular quality, its own particular light. A morning that smells of wet earth and clarity. A morning in which every color is deepened and every surface holds its small, bright mirror of sky. A morning that arrives with the particular freshness of things that have been thoroughly washed and returned to themselves. She will wake into that morning. She will stand at the window. She will see the garden, and the day will begin. And somewhere in the valley, the creek will be running full and clear and going on. And the world will be doing what it always does, turning quietly toward the light. The end. Thank you for spending this evening in Harrow's Crossing. May your own night be as quiet as the lane, as gentle as the rain, and as full of everything you need to rest well. Sleep deeply. You've earned it. For the record, Henry the rosebush is doing just fine.